Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, the technology revolution of the past, I'd say, 10 years has really transformed Africa as much as it's transformed anywhere in the world. Here in Southeast Asia, there is no way to escape it. Everybody's got mobile devices, the rise of YouTube, social networks, constant network, kind of attachments. And in Africa now, we're starting to see it. Africa was long considered to be the laggard in technology. You have these wonderful maps of the world where you see the kind of the server hotspots and server activities. And for a long time, Africa was dark. That is no longer the case. And in so many ways, it's because of the Chinese that those server farms are opening up in Africa, that the engagement on Facebook, that the mobile revolution is taking off. That is, it's the Chinese who are building the server networks through Huawei, the mobile networks with Huawei and ZTE. They're selling the low-cost devices that are designed for emerging markets in places like Africa. So in so many ways, the Chinese are helping to transform the ICT revolution, Internet Communications Technology revolution. They are by no means alone in this space, but they're playing a very important role. But with the Chinese comes some good. So in the case of the technology, which is really wonderful, people now can kind of speak to other people over the horizon for the very first time. They can engage networks, they can communicate, they can get better jobs, they can kind of find prices for agricultural and commodity goods. Everything that we can do on the internet, the Chinese are making it possible to do. But they are also bringing with them some of their more hostile practices in some countries. The oppression that we see in the digital space and the content space and the freedom of speech that is so common and typical in China is now being imported into parts of Africa. So with the good does come the bad. Cobus, it is a mixed blessing, but I guess in some ways that's what we can say about, everything with regards to the Chinese in Africa. It's never clear-cut or black and white.
Yeah, I would probably push back a little bit against the simple idea of Chinese oppression being imported into Africa. I think I would probably make a bit of a distinction between the means of oppression and the intention of oppression. Obviously lots of African governments are very oppressive. I think China is frequently they provides the tools. It provides new and more, more technologically advanced tools, which then land in a complicated African political landscape, where they're frequently kind of used to the ill. But yeah, I completely agree with you that in a lot of ways, like the same engagement, the same kind of networks bring both freedom and oppression to the same country frequently.
Well, we're going to have a little bit of dispute about that because I don't think I fully agree with you on that, but we luckily have somebody who can help kind of clarify this for us. And we are thrilled to have back on the show Ingenio Gallardano. Did I say your name correct? Close?
95% of it.
95%, my apologies. Ingenio is, also in Wits University, right, in the same department, in fact, as Cobus, in the Media and Communications department there in Johannesburg. And he's also an associate research fellow in new media and human rights at the University of Oxford in the UK. And the reason why we've invited Ingenio onto the show today is because he has just come out with a brand new book, The Politics of Technology in Africa, and rarely does a title of a book have three of my favorite things in the title itself. So congratulations and welcome back to the show, Ingenio.
Thank you very much. It feels great to be back, and now I'm also much closer to Cobus. So great to be talking from Wits this time.
Nice. Okay, well, let's get started on this dispute a little bit, this kind of, different interpretations as to what the Chinese are doing in Africa with regards to technology. And we'll get to the big picture of the technology movement. But so my sense is that the Chinese are not only importing the technology, but are also importing the kind of know-how in places like Ethiopia, and there are other places. I think Egypt and Tunisia are some of the other places where the Chinese are selling some of their technology, and also the deep packet inspection. They're selling also the methods and the tools for, controlling mobile phone networks, being able to turn off certain regions, for example, where there's unrest. And this is something they've done very effectively in China, for example, in Xinjiang in the West. When there's Muslim unrest, they're able to kind of darken out just that province. And I think they're bringing, and I've heard that they're bringing some of that know-how to places like Ethiopia, which also have quite a bit of unrest. Cobus, though, says it's the technology, and they're not necessarily bringing in that know-how per se. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Cobus. Where do you kind of fall? You've been doing research on this.
Just to clarify, what I meant is that, I would be aware of the idea that Africa is a kind of a blank slate, where the Chinese arrive and they bring their oppressive ways with them. I think there were plenty of oppressive ways in Africa already, and frequently these technologies get spun to fit African political realities and African power blocks. And African kind of elites make of these technologies what they want.
Okay.
But I mean that's just my view.
Fair.
Eugenio, in your work, I wonder if you could talk us a little bit for beginners. Give us a little bit of a thumbnail outline of what is the internet situation in Ethiopia, and how does government oppression kind of fit into it?
Yeah, well, to do that, I will take you in a bit of a journey that cuts into the debates that you have been having, because and especially resonates with your idea that I very much, Cobus, that I very much sympathize with. There is no blank slate. And when I started, this book has been long in the making. When I started researching the politics of technology in Ethiopia in particular, the main actors were a lot of consultants with suits coming from the World Bank or from the ITU, trying to convince Ethiopians that they should jump on their own, I'm going to say the World Bank version of the information society. And already without the Chinese, the Ethiopians pushed back quite a bit. And that doesn't mean simply resisting and saying no to technology, but trying to get to a point where they could master that technology in ways that could fit in their own state building and nation building plan. And that was an incredibly interesting journey to follow. So there could have been very little skills, very little understanding of the tools, but there was definitely a political understanding of what technology could do, both to empower the government at the time, but also to destabilize it. And that journey has not ended yet. And to continue on that journey is in 2005, there was no sign of Chinese engineers in the Ethiopian landscape. And it was so interesting. I used to live in Ethiopia between 2005 and 2008, and I went back for a longer period of time since to see China appearing on the horizon and immediately turning the tide into a different direction in ways that we're not trying at all to impose a particular view, trying to teach lessons that were coming from China, actually quite the opposite, but definitely to engage with that political vision that was very much emanating from the center of the Ethiopian governments that didn't resonate with Western donors, but was very much driven through with resources by the Ethiopian governments and later on by the Chinese. Let's not forget that China has given, since 2006 up to now, more than $3 billion to the Ethiopian government to completely overhaul the telecommunication system in the country.
Let's talk a little bit about the differences between the Western view of technology and the Chinese view. And we can expand it beyond Ethiopia. But oftentimes in the West, particularly the United States, we look to technology as a kind of all-encompassing solution. And there's this romanticization, idealization of what technology can do in places like Africa. So, for example, during the Arab Spring, part of the kind of State Department line coming out of Washington was by empowering people with connectivity, it will promote democracy. And there is this kind of notion that the State Department can facilitate the overthrow of oppressive and repressive governments by, wiring up the community, giving them access to the internet. There's a fantastic author by the name of Evgeny Morozov. He's an analyst who used to be at Harvard. I don't know where he is today. And he writes about how that's just complete and total rubbish. That when you give people access to the internet, the first things that they'll do is they'll go to download porn, they'll play games, they'll watch YouTube. That's kind of where human nature devolves to. He used the example that during the Cold War, when East Germans had access to West German content, they liked watching, soap operas and dramas and things like that. The Chinese seem to have a far more pragmatic view of technology, where it's a tool. It's much more functional. Obviously, they don't want to use it for overthrowing, repressive, non-democratic governments because, well, that's them. So talk to us a little bit about what you found in terms of these two worldviews, of how both the West, mainly the United States, and China sees the role of technology in a place like Africa.
Yeah, this is a very interesting lens through which to look at China's entrance in Africa, or relevance for Africa. But I also would like to talk later on about the similarities, because it's something that is not talked about. The West and China are often portrayed as two opposites of the spectrum. But there are some probably unintended consequences of their certainly different approach to technology that we are seeing in Africa and we could see elsewhere. So starting from the differences, it's the problem with the Western approach so far, and things have been changing somehow, has been a very keen understanding of the politics that comes with technology. And the Cold War, as Evgeny Morozov have said, mentality has unfortunately shaped also the thinking into the digital era. And the simple narrative of unfettered activists that are using technology to liberate themselves and their fellows from oppressive regime is definitely a powerful one, and one in which we would all like to believe in. China is very different on that regard. In a way, its relationship with technology is much more straightforward. There is much less hypocrisy, and but the result of these is further empowering those structures that already detain power. And here, maybe we're already moving towards the second bit, where the similarities are becoming more apparent. By doing so, they are not just the Chinese to be supporting existing power structures, but they have a very long list of allies. They're less visible, probably, but they do come from the West, and all those companies that sell surveillance technology and technology for censoring content. And some of these companies happen to be in Italy or in the UK. And so we get to the paradox by which we have Chinese engineers that are using Italian software in order to spy on political opponents living in Ethiopia or in the diaspora.
Eugenio, continuing on that point, in the book you made, you argue, which is I found very interesting, that the Ethiopian government, when they talk about kind of unpopular decisions, like, for example, the censoring of critics or the jailing of journalists and bloggers, they tend not to use the Chinese approach of just simply they don't tend not to align themselves with China and simply, simply like, this is the law and these people broke the law. Instead, they exploit ambiguities in Western discourses around technology and security and so on. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most interesting takeaway from the book and other research I have been working on. Because despite China has been recognized as a very successful example of technology diffusion and policies to get people on board and part of the information society. At the same time, it's still, when it comes to freedom of expression, it's still a model that can't be openly recognized as such, even by authoritarian regimes. So far in the research, I've never found head of states or political figures openly saying, well, we are following the Chinese model. We are going to do what China's done because we recognize it as a feasible one. So China does, despite the resilience of its model, has not managed to make it a model, something that other people would visibly try to emulate. A different story is for informal conversation with some of these individuals, where a different kind of take is advanced. The paradox, just apparent, is when censorship and surveillance with measures support leading to surveillance and censorship are adopted, is a different kind of agenda that is mentioned, is the anti-terrorism agenda, the agenda, that some refer to as the securitization of foreign policy or securitization of development. So we get to the paradox of head of states using the U.S.-supported narrative against terrorism to justify suppressions of freedom of expression that end up relying on Chinese technologies to get actually implemented. And these, I'm usually optimistic when it comes to technology and technology diffusion. There are tons of examples coming from Africa of local innovation, amazing new tools and applications that are being used to empower individuals. But if we take these two elements together, these two different forces, the future of the information societies in Africa, at least in some regime, doesn't look bright at all.
Well, let's pick up on that, because I think it's very interesting to kind of put some context around this and talking about the leadership and whether or not they understand the technology. And the most glaring example of an African leader who did not understand the technology was Hosni Mubarak at the end of his reign in Egypt during the Arab Spring. And one of the things that kind of stood out for me is that Hosni Mubarak was looking for the organizers of the Arab Spring in Cairo. And there weren't any. It was the network that organized it. It was social media, it was mobile phones, and it was he misread the times because he didn't understand the technology. And that was, contributing to his downfall because he didn't know how to respond to what was happening and to those events. One of the problems with Africa is the lack of governance has led to a number of leaderships that are, undemocratic, anti-democratic, or not being refreshed enough. Paul Kagame is a good example in Rwanda. He may have started out democratic, but, now we're a long ways away from democracy in Rwanda. Joseph Kabila, obviously, in the DRC and whatnot. So in your research for the book, The Politics of Technology in Africa, I'm curious, did you get a sense that inside these governments, whether it's at the top level or at the sub-ministerial level or wherever, that they understood the technology that was now shaping their countries, and that they were using themselves to kind of inform, to educate, but also to repress?
Well, this is a difficult question. I will try to answer it in two main ways. Looking at the case of Ethiopia, but also the case of Rwanda that you mentioned would fit, I would say that leaders have become very skillful in playing with the symbols of democracy. And election is one of the main ones. The past election in Ethiopia were won by the incumbent party by 100%. But they still recognize a free and fair election. And also international observers say there was not cheating in the ballots. The elections, even online, we completed recently a project called Mechachal, which means tolerance in Amharic, where we mapped online conversation on Facebook around the elections. And these become secured spaces where netizens, where people going online to express their views and their frustration, sort of lose hope that anything can be done. So there is these spaces, these moments where states, governments, power is on full alert, and it's very difficult to, let's say, hack those. At the same time, as we see from the recent protest, not that recent, it has been going on for the past few months, in Oromia, for example, outside of these events that have become like the symbols of the supposed democracy, people still revolt. The same things that happened in Egypt. There was no elections, nobody believed in elections, but the sense of disempowerment and lack of voice still find ways online and offline in leading to outcomes that are potentially very dramatic. So as much as there is understanding of the tools, there is never complete control. So you can secure an election both online and offline, but at the same time, if there is suppression elsewhere, something is going to happen. even in the most suppressive of the regimes. And the second bit of the answer is at the core of the book, I'm talking about something that is more difficult to explain because there are not many examples like this. There are two very large technical projects. Let's say one is an e-government project connecting the center of the government with the local administration. The other one is let's say, e-learning project based on thousands of plasma TV screens in all secondary schools in the country. And these are very good example of how the government has appropriated technology so that messages that are emanating from the center of power can reach down to the grassroots. So many individuals in the civil service could be exposed on a regular basis to the very voice of the prime minister that was instructing them in what they should be doing. At the same time, high school students would be trained not by teachers that could provide context to what we were saying, but again, by sort of pre-recorded content that was shaping mind in a particular direction. So this is a very unique, bit scary, but somehow quite effective ways in which technology is understood is shaped to fit a very specific agenda.
To move to the Chinese side of this equation, you make very interesting points in the book that there's some that breaks down the kind of monolithic view of China as an actor, and especially in relation to obviously the difference between Chinese financing and then the Chinese contractors that implement the projects, but also within the contracts, differences between the state-owned company ZTE and the private company Huawei. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the differences between Huawei and ZTE in Ethiopia and how they see each other.
That has been very interesting, and it's been, this relationship is very much in the making. ZTE has been the first Chinese company to come to Ethiopia, supported by a very large loan from the Chinese government, $1.6 billion. And Huawei came only at a later stage. The company, as it has been definitely the case in China, but is also happening often in Africa, have been competing against each other for resources. So the image of the Chinese government directing Chinese companies doesn't really apply to Ethiopia. One very interesting takeaway from Ethiopia that doesn't necessarily apply to other countries is that, and sort of challenges the Chinese approach of no strings attached. So I do believe, and the finding that I collected support the idea that China didn't come with a template, just simply tried to fulfill the demands of the Ethiopian government. But the Ethiopian government has tried to hold on a monopoly of telecommunication that has not worked anywhere, including in China. And the result of these is that there was no interest from the side of ZTE to innovate, to produce reliable services. And in the regime of no competition, the quality of the service of the, now it's called Ethio Telecom, used to be ETC, has been one of the worst in the continent. When Huawei came into the picture, it was to produce artificially somehow some of the competition that could not be allowed by the market. But the relationship with ZTE got so sour because there was no incentive on either side to improve that at some point the government became so frustrated with ZTE that it rescinded the contract just last year and turned it back to Ericsson, to European telecom company. And so to sum up, it's the complete hands-off type of approach. We get everything that is being asked. Doesn't seem to work either. There's so many lessons at the practical level that China could teach to a country like Ethiopia. China has opened up and liberalized its own telecommunication market slowly in a way that could be managed, but at the end of the day was quite successful. And by not suggesting or not enforcing this kind of policy on Ethiopia, everybody at the end of the day were worse off.
Cobus, it's a shame that we don't have more time because we've really focused on Huawei and ZTE and the government side of things, when in fact that's really only part of the story when we talk about the Chinese influence and impact on technology in Africa. WeChat, which is on the software side, which is social networking, is now trying to make its way into Africa. WeChat, of course, is partially South African owned by Naspers. There's also Baidu, the Chinese search giant that now has a North African service that they're kind of trying to big out. And the Chinese software firms like Alibaba are trying to make their way in, and there's all sorts of e-commerce platforms that are now kind of, coming online, and that's the private sector that's bringing a lot of this. And I think there's this real dynamism in the private sector, whether it's from the hardware devices like Xiaomi, who's now opening up its first retail stores in South Africa, Huawei, ZTE, which are opening up research centers around the continent. And so it seems to me, Cobus, that this is a far more nuanced and textured story than we have made it out to be in our discussion, and oftentimes it gets overlooked by the public at large.
I also think so. There's one massive gap in the talking about all of this, and that is what ordinary Africans are doing with these networks and devices. Because it's one thing to bring something like WeChat to Africa. It's something completely different to see what Africans actually do with that technology, whether they're going to use it the same way as Chinese do, for example, which I would greatly doubt. So I think it's going to be, that's the new frontier for research, I think, is to see how these networks and how these devices actually land on the ground in Africa and how they're going to be used in the future.
Well, Eugenio, give us the kind of the short and medium term forecast that you see for answering Cobus's question.
Well, I think China has shown greater adaptability to different markets. We talked a lot about Ethiopia or repressive regimes. A completely different story can be told for Ghana or for Kenya, where there is very little state intervention, and most of the partnership have happened at the level of the private sector and also local small entrepreneurs. So I agree with Cobus that there's going to be a lot of low-level innovation that can't be really captured by foreign policy analysts, but has to be seen on the ground in everyday life. One other thing, there is a lot of attention on China's soft power. And I remember last time we talked, it was about CCTV Africa and the television opening on the continent. I think paradoxically, the dramatic improvement in hardware coming from China is also serving a very important role in changing the image of what China is doing in Africa. I think we also, the recent Afrobarometer study about perception of China in Africa, it was very interesting to notice that the bad quality of Chinese product is what causes negative perception, and infrastructure development is what is at the base of positive perception of Africa. When we talk about ICT, these are caught in a paradox. They are infrastructure, they are very expensive, but you can't see them. So the money that China pour into technology, the big money we have been talking about, is not really there to catch the eye as much as a highway or a stadium would. At the same time, the little technology, the handset, is what people have in their hands all the time. It's by improving the handset that actually some of the perception might change and are actually changing. And this is another very interesting space to look at.
It's fascinating because I think you're right that I think China deserves far more credit, and the Chinese companies in the private sector, for what they've done to improve ICT in Africa than they get. And so, and a lot of it's just out of sight, and people don't understand, the 3G dongle that's connected to their PC, which is Huawei or Lenovo, on their Lenovo or Huawei or ZTE or Xiaomi device, and connected to Huawei networks, connected to fiber that's laid down by the Chinese, and all of that's out of sight, but it just magically happens. It is an absolutely fascinating, complicated, contradictory topic. A lot of it's being discussed in Eugenio's new book, The Politics of Technology in Africa, that will be coming out soon. Eugenio, when can we expect to see this on bookstores and Kindle pages soon?
The official date is 30th of November, so just in a few weeks.
Just in a few weeks. Well, Eugenio Gagliardoni teaches media and communications at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, alongside Cobus in the same department. Are you guys in the same hallway there?
Oh, yes, we're literally a few offices down from each other.
Nice, okay. So you have no excuse now not to come back on our show. And he's also an associate research fellow in new media and human rights at the University of Oxford. Again, congratulations on the book. I know that you are pretty active on Twitter, and so if people want to follow you and kind of stay on top of both your talks to promote the book and also what you're thinking and writing about these days, what's the best way for people to follow you on Twitter?
Is my first name, which is Eugenio, with an E at the end. Eugenio E.
Can you spell that for us?
Is Iginio.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Thanks so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show, or follow China Africa News that's updated every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadenesque or Eric at Eolander. That's EOLANDER. Subscribe to the China Africa podcast on iTunes or download the mobile apps for iOS, Android, or Windows Phone. Just head over to your favorite store and search for China Africa.